Imagine a place where hope was carried up a hill, and thousands were carried back down in silence. In 1910, people entered Waverly Hills Sanatorium believing fresh air would save them, but many never left. They say the halls still remember their suffering. The walls still whisper their names. And once you hear its story, it never truly lets you go. High on a lonely hill outside Louisville, Kentucky, where fog curls around the trees like restless spirits, stands Waverly Hills Sanatorium. It opened its doors in 1910, built not as a place of fear, but as a place of hope. At that time, tuberculosis was a death sentence, a slow and suffocating illness that stole breath and life alike. People came here believing the hilltop air might save them. Many never left. Inside, the long hallways seemed endless, echoing with coughs, prayers, and quiet cries. Day after day, patients lay in rows of beds, watching sunlight creep across the walls, knowing night might bring another goodbye. Nurses moved softly, their footsteps hushed, as if the building itself demanded silence. Death became so common that it slipped through the corridors like an invisible guest, never knocking, never leaving. As the years passed, thousands died within these walls. To hide the constant loss from the living patients, bodies were carried through a dark underground passage known as the body chute, sliding silently down the hill. Even today, people say that sadness still clings to that tunnel, heavy and cold, as if the souls of the dead never found their way out. This is why Waverly Hills is so famous across the United States. It is not just an abandoned hospital, it is a symbol of human suffering, endurance, and unanswered questions. Visitors report seeing apparitions of patients in old hospital gowns, hearing screams when the building is empty, and watching shadow people move at the edge of their vision. Some speak of children laughing, others of a nurse who still checks rooms long after her shift should have ended. The past here does not feel finished. America calls Waverly Hills the most haunted hospital because the pain was real, the deaths were countless, and the memories seem alive. The building stands as a reminder of a time when medicine failed, hope faded, and spirits, whether ghosts, jinn, or echoes of trauma, may still wander its halls. At night, when the wind presses against broken windows, it feels as though the sanatorium is breathing again, telling its story to anyone brave enough to listen. When Waverly Hills Sanatorium opened in 1910, it was born out of desperation rather than fear. At the start of the 20th century, tuberculosis was one of the deadliest diseases in America. It did not kill quickly, it lingered. Victims coughed for months, sometimes years, slowly losing strength, breath, and hope. Families watched loved ones fade away, helpless, as the illness spread silently through crowded homes and cities. Kentucky was hit hard, and Louisville needed a place to isolate the sick before the disease swallowed even more lives. That need gave rise to Waverly Hills. The original structure was modest, standing on a hill chosen for its fresh air, believed at the time to be one of the few weapons against tuberculosis. Doctors believed sunlight, clean mountain breezes, and rest could cure what medicine could not. Patients were brought up the winding road, to the hill with hope in their eyes, even as fear sat heavy in their chests. Many believed this place would save them. For some it did. For many others, it became the last place they ever saw. As tuberculosis cases exploded, the sanatorium expanded. By the 1920s, Waverly Hills had grown into a massive 5-story building capable of housing hundreds of patients at once. Every room was filled. Beds lined open wards, sometimes separated only by thin curtains. The sound of coughing never stopped. Day and night, it echoed through the halls like a dark rhythm, reminding everyone inside that death was always near. Nurses and doctors worked tirelessly, often at great personal risk, knowing they too could catch the disease simply by breathing the same air. Treatment was harsh and experimental. There were no antibiotics yet. Patients were forced into long periods of bed rest, sometimes strapped down to prevent movement, because even sitting up was believed to worsen the illness. Others underwent terrifying procedures where ribs were removed or lungs were intentionally collapsed in a desperate attempt to rest them. These treatments were painful, risky, and often unsuccessful. Many patients died not only from the disease, but from the suffering it caused both physically and emotionally. Death became so frequent that it changed how the building functioned. To protect the morale of those still clinging to life, the staff tried to hide the truth. Bodies were not carried through the main hallways. Instead, they were sent through a long underground passage leading downhill, away from the sanatorium. This tunnel became a silent witness to countless deaths. Night after night, stretchers slid through darkness, carrying men, women, and even children who had arrived with hope and left as numbers in a growing count. Thousands are believed to have died at Waverly Hills during its years as a tuberculosis hospital. Exact numbers are uncertain, but the scale of loss is undeniable. Each death left behind unfinished dreams, broken families, and unanswered prayers. The walls absorbed it all, the fear, the pain, the waiting. Over time, the building became more than bricks and concrete. It became a container for human suffering on a massive scale. This deep and tragic history is the foundation of Waverly Hills' reputation. Long before stories of ghosts and shadow figures emerged, there was real horror here. The horror of watching people slowly disappear, of hearing final breaths echo through shared rooms, of knowing that survival was never guaranteed. The sheer number of lives lost, combined with the intense emotional weight of prolonged illness, created an atmosphere unlike any other. Even when the hospital later closed, it felt as though something had been left behind, as if the sorrow itself refused to leave the hill. The suffering inside Waverly Hills Sanatorium was not limited to physical illness. It reached deeply into the minds and souls of everyone who lived and worked there. Tuberculosis was a slow disease, and that slowness was perhaps its cruelest trait. Patients did not arrive and quickly pass away. Instead, they lingered for months or even years, trapped between hope and despair. Each morning they woke to the same white walls, the same narrow beds, the same heavy air filled with coughing and whispered prayers. Time seemed to stretch unnaturally, making every day feel longer than the last, as if the building itself was holding them in place. Emotionally, the patients carried an unbearable weight. Many were young, taken from their families at a time when life should have been opening before them. Children were separated from parents, husbands from wives, mothers from infants. Visits were limited, sometimes forbidden, out of fear that the disease would spread. Loneliness became a constant companion. People watched others around them grow weaker, vanish into other wings of the hospital, or disappear altogether, knowing that the same fate might be waiting for them. Every empty bed was a silent reminder of death, more frightening than any spoken word. For those who worked at Waverly Hills, the trauma was just as severe. Nurses and doctors entered the profession to heal, yet here they were surrounded by loss on a daily basis. They formed bonds with patients, listened to their stories, and offered comfort, all while knowing that many would not survive. The emotional strain of watching countless people die, one after another, left deep scars. Some staff members reportedly grew numb, while others carried guilt and grief long after their shifts ended. Even stepping outside the building did not free them from its shadow. The environment itself added to the torment. The massive structure, with its long corridors and high ceilings, often felt cold and impersonal. Sounds traveled endlessly: coughs, cries, footsteps, the squeak of medical carts, blending into a constant reminder of illness and fear. At night, when lights were dimmed, and the hill was swallowed by darkness, the sanatorium felt especially oppressive. Patients lay awake listening to the wind press against windows, wondering if they would see another sunrise. Sleep offered little escape, as dreams were often filled with fear, memories of home, and visions of death. This prolonged suffering created a kind of emotional residue, as if every feeling of fear, pain, and despair soaked into the walls. People were not just dying, they were waiting to die, and that waiting was filled with terror, regret, and unanswered questions. Prayers were whispered in the dark. Promises were made to God, to fate, to anyone who might listen. Some patients begged to go home, even knowing it could mean death, simply to escape the suffocating atmosphere of the hospital. Others lost the will to fight entirely, surrendering to the illness long before their bodies failed. Over time, this continuous emotional trauma gave Waverly Hills a reputation that went beyond its medical purpose. The building became associated with sadness and dread, a place where hope was fragile and often short-lived. When people later began reporting strange experiences, feelings of being watched, sudden waves of sorrow, unexplained cold spots, it felt natural to connect them to the intense suffering that once filled the halls. Whether one believes in ghosts, jinn, or psychological echoes, it is impossible to deny that Waverly Hills was shaped by overwhelming human pain. The suffering did not end when the last patient left. It seemed to linger, woven into the very identity of the building, waiting in silence for someone to sense it again. One of the darkest and most disturbing elements of Waverly Hills Sanatorium was the underground passage known as the body chute. And its existence speaks volumes about the scale of death and the psychological horror that surrounded life inside the hospital. This tunnel was not created out of mystery or superstition. It was built out of necessity. Death occurred so frequently that carrying bodies through the main hallways became emotionally damaging for patients who were still alive. Seeing the dead every day crushed morale and destroyed the fragile hope many patients were holding on to. To preserve that hope, the dead were hidden from the living, quietly removed through darkness. The body chute was a long, sloping tunnel that ran from the hospital down the hill, away from the main building. It allowed staff to transport bodies discreetly, often late at night, when the halls were quiet and patients were asleep or too weak to notice. Wrapped in sheets, the bodies were placed on stretchers or carts and sent down the tunnel in silence. There were no prayers spoken loudly, no final goodbyes from loved ones, Death here was efficient, routine, and cold. Over time, this process stripped death of dignity, turning human lives into something that needed to be moved quickly and quietly, like an inconvenience that must not disturb the living. Emotionally, this secrecy added another layer of horror. Patients were not fools. They noticed when beds were suddenly empty. They knew when someone had died, even if no one said it aloud. The silence surrounding death made it more terrifying. It became something unseen but constantly present, lurking just out of sight. The knowledge that bodies were being taken away through a hidden passage only deepened the fear. Many patients lay awake at night imagining what happened after someone took their final breath, picturing that dark tunnel and wondering if they themselves would soon be sent down it. The body chute also affected the staff in profound ways. Nurses and orderlies who worked in the tunnel carried a heavy burden. They were the last people to touch the dead, to guide them through darkness, after lives filled with suffering. Repeating this task night after night hardened some and broke others. The tunnel became a place where grief had no voice. There was no space for mourning, no time to process loss. The dead were moved, the tunnel emptied, and the work continued. This emotional suppression did not erase pain, it buried it deep inside the people and the place. Symbolically, the body chute represents how Waverly Hills tried to separate life from death while housing both under the same roof. Above ground, patients were encouraged to believe in recovery, sunlight, and fresh air. Below ground, the reality waited, cold, dark, and final. This contrast created a powerful psychological divide, as if the hospital existed in two worlds at once. One world clung to hope, while the other quietly accepted loss. Over time, these two worlds blurred, leaving behind a sense that death was never truly hidden, only delayed. Today, the body chute is one of the most talked about features of Waverly Hills. Visitors report overwhelming feelings of sadness, pressure in the chest, sudden chills, and an intense sense of dread while standing inside it. Some claim to hear footsteps or feel as if someone is walking beside them in the dark. Whether these experiences are paranormal, emotional, or psychological, the impact of the tunnel is undeniable. It carries the weight of thousands of final journeys, each one silent, unseen, and unresolved. The tunnel stands as a physical reminder of how deeply death shaped Waverly Hills. It was not just a passageway. It was a boundary between hope and despair, between the living and the dead. Every body that passed through it left behind an imprint of fear, grief, and unfinished life. Even now, the darkness of the chute feels heavy, as if it remembers every soul that traveled its length and refuses to forget. As years passed and Waverly Hills Sanatorium fell silent, stories began to rise from its empty halls, slowly shaping its reputation across the United States as one of the most haunted places ever built. What makes Point 4 so powerful is not just the number of paranormal claims, but the consistency and emotional intensity behind them. Visitors, former staff, and paranormal investigators, many of whom had never met or shared stories, reported remarkably similar experiences. Apparitions, unexplained screams, shadow figures, and voices became part of the identity of Waverly Hills, transforming it from an abandoned hospital into a national symbol of the unexplained. One of the most commonly reported phenomena is the appearance of full-bodied apparitions. People claim to see patients dressed in early 20th century hospital gowns standing in doorways or walking slowly down corridors, only to vanish when approached. These figures are often described as pale, thin, and sorrowful, mirroring the physical condition of tuberculosis patients. Some visitors report seeing a nurse moving from room to room, checking on beds that no longer exist, as if trapped in an endless routine. The unsettling part is not just seeing these figures, but the feeling that they are unaware of the living, locked in a moment that never ended. Sounds are another major reason Waverly Hills gained national fame. Screams echoing through empty rooms, coughing from dark corners, footsteps on staircases with no one there. These experiences are frequently reported, especially at night. Investigators have captured audio recordings where whispers seem to respond to questions, and sudden cries pierce the silence without explanation. Even skeptics admit that the acoustics of the building cannot fully explain the emotional weight carried by these sounds. They do not feel random. They feel purposeful, as if something is trying to be heard. Shadow people are among the most disturbing encounters. Visitors describe tall, dark shapes moving along walls or darting across hallways, often seen only out of the corner of the eye. These shadows are not solid figures, yet they feel aware, watching, observing. Some report being followed, sensing a presence just behind them, matching their pace. This creates an intense psychological response, heart racing, breath tightening, similar to fear responses described by patients long ago. Whether supernatural or not, the experience leaves a lasting impression that many struggle to explain. Certain rooms have become infamous. One room in particular, often referred to as a former children's ward, is associated with laughter, small footsteps, and the feeling of playful yet unsettling energy. Another area is known for sudden emotional shifts. People report overwhelming sadness, anger, or fear without warning, as if emotions from the past are bleeding into the present. These emotional reactions are a key reason Waverly Hills stands out among haunted locations. It is not just about what people see or hear, but what they feel. Because of the sheer volume of reports, Waverly Hills has been featured in countless horror documentaries, paranormal television shows, podcasts, and books. Investigators return again and again, drawn by the building's reputation and the high level of activity reported there. This media attention has cemented its status in American culture as the most haunted hospital in the country. Unlike places tied to a single tragedy, Waverly Hills represents prolonged suffering over decades, making its paranormal reputation feel layered and deeply rooted. What truly makes these experiences powerful is the connection people feel between the haunting and the hospital's history. The apparitions resemble former patients. The screams echo the pain once endured. The shadow figures seem born from darkness and despair. For many, this connection makes the hauntings feel less like fiction and more like an extension of real human suffering. Whether explained through ghosts, jinn, spirits, or psychological memory, the stories persist because they feel believable, shaped by history rather than imagination. The fame of Waverly Hills grows not just from fear, but from the sense that the past here is still awake, watching, and unwilling to be forgotten. What ultimately places Waverly Hills Sanatorium in a category of its own is the powerful feeling that its story never truly ended. Many places in America have tragic pasts, but at Waverly Hills, the sense of incompleteness is overwhelming. The building does not feel like a memory frozen in time. It feels active, as if the pain, fear, and unanswered emotions are still moving through its corridors. This is why it is often described not simply as haunted, but as unfinished. The suffering that occurred there was prolonged, repetitive, and deeply personal, leaving behind emotional echoes that refuse to fade. Thousands of people came to Waverly Hills with hope, and many died slowly after months of waiting. They did not experience sudden accidents or quick deaths. They endured drawn-out illness, isolation, and fear. This kind of suffering leaves behind more than history. It leaves behind unresolved emotion. Patients died far from home, separated from loved ones, often without closure or final goodbyes. Some passed away believing they had failed their families or been forgotten by the world. That emotional weight, multiplied by thousands, created an atmosphere thick with unfinished thoughts, broken promises, and silent goodbyes. The hospital also changed purpose several times after its tuberculosis era ended. It closed, reopened, and was repurposed for different medical uses, including as a facility for mental health patients. These later years brought their own forms of pain, confusion, and neglect, further adding layers of trauma to the building's identity. Instead of healing what remained, each new chapter seemed to disturb what was already there. The building was never given the peace of a final ending. It lingered in abandonment, decay, and silence, allowing stories and fears to grow unchecked. Visitors often describe a strange sensation the moment they enter Waverly Hills, a feeling of being watched, of stepping into someone else's sorrow. Some experience sudden emotional shifts, becoming anxious, sad, or overwhelmed without any clear reason. Others feel as though they do not belong there, as if the building itself is resisting their presence. These reactions are not limited to believers in the supernatural. Even skeptics report an intense atmosphere that is difficult to ignore. This shared experience adds to the belief that something remains unresolved. Waverly Hills also stands apart because its haunting feels collective rather than singular. There is no single ghost story, no one tragic event that explains everything. Instead, there are thousands of overlapping lives, each with its own pain and fear. This creates a sense of constant activity, as if the building is crowded with memories rather than empty. The apparitions, voices, and shadow figures reported by visitors feel like fragments of countless stories, replaying at once, without order or resolution. In American culture, Waverly Hills has become a symbol of how suffering can outlive the people who experienced it. It represents the idea that places remember, that walls can absorb emotion, and that time does not always erase pain. This belief resonates deeply in a country fascinated by both history and the supernatural. Waverly Hills is not feared simply because it is old or abandoned, but because it reflects a very human truth. Unresolved trauma does not disappear when life ends. The building's continued presence on the hill, decaying yet standing, reinforces this idea. It watches over the land like a silent witness, refusing to collapse completely, as if holding on to something inside. Each broken window and crumbling wall feels less like decay and more like exposure, revealing what was hidden for so long. People are drawn to it not only to be scared, but to understand, to feel, and to confront the weight of the past. This is why Waverly Hills is remembered as more than America's most haunted hospital. It is seen as a place where history is alive, where endings never arrived, and where the line between past and present feels dangerously thin. The fear it inspires is not just of ghosts or spirits, but of unfinished suffering, of lives that never found peace, and a building that still carries their story, waiting for someone to listen. As history moved forward, medicine finally found answers that Waverly Hills never had. In the 1940s, antibiotics were developed, and tuberculosis slowly lost its grip on the world. Patients no longer needed to be sent away to isolated hills to wait for recovery or death. By the early 1960s, the sanatorium's original purpose had ended, and its long wards fell quiet. The beds were emptied, the windows closed, and the hill that once echoed with coughs and footsteps was left to the wind. What remained was a building filled with memories of struggle, sacrifice, and a time when humanity fought a deadly disease with hope, faith, and endurance rather than certainty. Waverly Hills stands today not just as a haunted place, but as a historical monument to human resilience. It reminds us how far medical science has come, and how much suffering once existed before answers were found. The fear associated with the building is deeply tied to its past, but so is its importance. It tells the story of thousands who lived, fought, and died during one of the darkest chapters of medical history. Remembering Waverly Hills is not only about ghosts and mystery. It is about honoring lives that shaped the future of healing. If this story pulled you into its shadows and helped you understand the history behind the fear, don't let it end here. Share this speech so others can learn the truth hidden within these walls, and subscribe for more real stories where history, mystery, and human experience meet. Your support keeps these forgotten voices alive and their stories remembered.